So as I have talked about many times on my channel, we are about to be flooded with fantasy adaptations. Absolutely inundated to an ungodly degree with adaptations of classic fantasy, modern fantasy, sci-fi, classic sci-fi. It really is going across the board. I don't need to be wearing headphones. And what I want to do in this video is talk about a couple things that people do need to keep in mind going forward, and also temper expectations and try and raise expectations a little bit. I feel like people are here when it's more reasonable to be about a here. We need to really focus on the here. First and foremost, yes, this is happening as a result of Game of Thrones. These studios want to have their own HBO smash hit success Game of Thrones level event, and the genre without doubt will hit a saturation point. And it's happened before. We've seen this happen with cop procedurals, with westerns. It's just a pattern of television. When one network has a smash hit, every other network wants to try and match it. The only difference is now it's not networks necessarily, it's also streaming services, which have the ability to put out more content faster than ever before. But that doesn't necessarily mean bad content. It just means more. And many shows will fail. I would say a majority will probably fail. And some of the ones that fail might even be really good, but just can't find their audience because everything is so split. Not everyone can watch the 60 plus shows that are coming down the road, the 20 of which that'll probably actually get made and premiere, and splitting to that point is still too much. This is a key part of the streaming war, which is something I'm going to make a video on in the future because it is affecting us fantasy fans quite drastically, actually. So that seems pretty pessimistic, and I do mean it to in some ways. The purpose of creating these shows is to make money. If you think otherwise, you are wrong. Yes, there are people involved in making the shows who want to make them and are very passionate and care. That's great, and I love those people. But there are corporations behind these adaptations. Their goal is to take your money. That's how capitalism works. Now, I say all this negative sounding stuff to then add the caveat that I'm very excited, and I think a lot of these will be great because the bar is higher than it has ever been. And a failed show, especially a fantasy adaptation that requires a pretty big initial investment, is painful for these studios. To a really high degree. They don't want to lose that amount of money, so they know they need to go big or go home. So a lot of these franchises that we love are probably going to get huge initial investments to try and kick it off right. It is then up to us, the audiences, to try and pick and find the ones that are worth our time, we feel are good enough to support, and go from there. Sad part is there's probably so many that not everyone can support every show they like. There's going to be like 10 alone in 2020. Not everyone can watch all 10 of those fantasy adaptations. End of story. And some do have an unfair advantage just due to name recognition. The Witcher show probably has less name recognition than the Game of Thrones prequel that's being worked on. They'll be in direct conflict with each other in terms of staying power, and I hope they both do well, but neither are promised to find the success in audiences, though I would lean to the Game of Thrones prequel having the advantage. While Witcher does have name recognition as well, it's not on the same level as Game of Thrones. Full stop. Does it sound like I'm adding stress and pressure to just enjoying TV? Because that's kind of what I'm doing, but I don't mean it to. Watch what you like and don't care beyond that. But again, I say all of this fairly negative sounding stuff that is a little bit unfair. The best show might have no name recognition and a poor marketing budget, so it falls flat on its face and doesn't take off. That could happen. But I do believe we are going to see the best representations that we have ever seen of these series, names, and franchises that we love by far. Because every one of these studios wants to have that Game of Thrones, and they have to acknowledge, especially with the poor reception the end of Game of Thrones got because of the decline in writing quality, that they need to bring their A game to all aspects of these shows. Yeah, people love visual effects and we have high standards for that. You can't cheap out there. But we also have very high standards for writing, producing, acting, directing, and that's why you're seeing a lot of these people who were working on Game of Thrones and have worked on other big name projects from Disney to Marvel being brought into these other fantasy sci-fi adaptations because The studios are nervous. They know they could flop even if they have great source material now. It's not one of these half-ass, half-invested things we've seen before. If you look at the way these studios are approaching these fantasy adaptations, so many of them, not all of them, so many of them are investing heavier than they ever have before. They're bringing in big names who will draw audiences. They're going to be marketing hard. I promise you we're going to be inundated with marketing within the next 6 months to a year for a lot of these shows, and it'll be really interesting to see which ones stand out. So now put yourself in the shoes of these studio executives, and this is why I think we're suddenly going to see a lot of these fantasy shows who have been bought up, announced, but haven't entered production slowly fade away and not actually happen. So we have between, I think my last count was pushing 90 IPs bought up, but the number of those that have actually entered production is more like maybe 10. And I would assume another 10 or so in the near future will also enter production. But after that, I think many of these studios that have bought IPs are going to either want to sit on them or sell them off again. That is largely due to them seeing the market becoming saturated. And if you're late to the game, if you're not even at the level of production that a Wheel of Time is, where their shooting schedule isn't even until September, you might be in trouble because a lot of these shows are getting hype. And if you are only just getting started, just getting announced, you might not ever get the momentum you need. And these studios know this. They've seen this in the past again and again, where a good show just doesn't find its footing and feet and falls and can barely even make it past a pilot. So Wheel of Time for me right now is at like the cusp. This is where the wave is really going to be. They're going to shoot late this year, and we're probably going to see marketing material for it early next year, a little bit beyond that. And then we are going to start seeing these fantasy series released. Probably the first one's going to be The Witcher. That one seems to be ahead of the curve quite a bit. For the shows after this first wave of Game of Thrones prequel, Witcher, Wheel of Time, His Dark Materials, etc., there are a few movies mixed in there as well. They're going to be the ones who really struggle. I think if you're earlier on in production than Wheel of Time, you're going to start struggling, because especially the big names like Witcher and Wheel of Time are going to soak up a large portion of these audiences. Yes, Gentlemen Bastards is loved, for example, and if a TV show was announced for it, the fans would be ecstatic. But you can't survive as a fantasy adaptation with just the initial fan base, and they would have to then grow and expand beyond the audience they capture with just that announcement. And if, let's say, the 30% of people who are willing to watch a fantasy adaptation are already watching Wheel of Time and a Game of Thrones prequel, and another third are watching Witcher and the Avatar: The Last Airbender series that's coming at Netflix, then you're left with a shrunken percentage, and you need to try and convince them to watch yours. Even though your Gentlemen Bastards is great, it's some of the best source material in fantasy currently, you're going to be competing with the Dresden Files adaptation coming down the road, and about 5 others that are going to be either sci-fi or fantasy, all pushing for that same market. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, you can just go after the people watching Wheel of Time. But a lot of people aren't willing to split their viewing time that much. I know people like you and me are. If you're watching this video, you're probably a very big fantasy fan. But how many people that you know or diehard Game of Thrones fans are actually going off and watching and reading a whole lot of other fantasy now? It's a lower percentage. And that's where the streaming service aspect of this comes in again, painfully. Amazon has a leg up because their streaming service is tied in with Amazon Prime, which is a whole other debacle, and every one of their customers is valued so much more than one Netflix subscriber. But that's a whole other video in itself. Because if you're a streaming service and you release one of these shows, content is king 10 times more so than it used to be when it comes to these streaming services. And if your show that you've spent so much of your budget, time, and effort and marketing into flops, that's an immediate negative return on investment, and you're not going to be able to maybe catch it in reruns. You're not going to be able to try and just put it after a time slot of another popular show. No, you're a streaming service. You need people to be willing to pay the entry fee, get in the door, and start subscribing just for that show. And the initial release is where that's supposed to happen. And getting it to happen beyond that point is extraordinarily difficult. It's largely true that every new big show that something like a Netflix is putting out, yes, is for their current subscribers to enjoy, but it's way more valuable to them if their show is interesting enough to get them a subscriber. They care a lot more about adding a monthly source of revenue. Amazon, if you look it up, cares so much about how many more people sign up for Prime than actual views a show brings in. So let's say they release their new season of insert whatever show here, and it only gets a few 100,000 to 1 million views, but it also brings in tens of thousands of new Amazon Prime members. They're happy, they're fine with that, because those people are, one, going to be paying a monthly Amazon fee, and also probably going to be shopping on Amazon a lot more now that they do have Prime. So there's, again, a whole other level of layer there for the streaming services and streaming wars for Amazon. They have this weird edge, but also additional complications. I don't know, it's fascinating to me. But this whole conversation is just stressful in a way, but it's important to remember that you as the viewer really don't have to care about it. Watch what you want to watch and enjoy it. But to me, it will be fascinating to see how these streaming services battle, how they use our beloved franchises as the main front line of the assault, because that seems to be their plan, and who manages to stand out using what strategies. So how do you guys feel about the streaming wars in fantasy and sci-fi and how they've all been tied in together? Everyone wants to win the streaming wars with the next big, MCU on Netflix thing, which is being pulled away for Disney Plus, or maybe the next Game of Thrones on HBO, but HBO might be able to retain a lot of that audience if their prequels pan out. It's fascinating. It is without a doubt fascinating, and I will make more videos on this in the future as this whole streaming war evolves. I do think Amazon, though, has a very unique edge with their whole larger Amazon attached, because every new subscriber they get is so much more valuable than just one new Netflix subscriber, at least from the research I've done. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and have a good one, y'all. Peace. Special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Lunar Magic. Great name. I actually really like that one. That's fantastic. Look out for actual short stories from excerpts from my book coming to the Patreon before too long. I'm going to get started on those within the week. Have a good one, y'all.